The storm had already torn through Newbern when Officer Wesley Grant saw something moving in the floodwater. At first, he thought it was debris. Then the little head lifted. A 2-month-old puppy was clinging to a broken piece of wood with everything he had left. His body was almost completely underwater. His paws kept slipping. His eyes were barely open. Wesley turned toward his patrol car for a life ring. He took only a few steps. Then he looked back. The piece of wood was still there. The puppy was gone. Wesley ran straight into the water. He found the tiny dog beneath the surface and pulled him up. But before he could make it back to shore, the storm returned with enough force to sweep them both away. The puppy climbed onto Wesley's shoulder. Wesley fought the current until he spotted an old wooden boat and dragged them both aboard. His radio was failing. Night was coming. And the puppy in his arms was colder, weaker, and far more exhausted than a dog who had only been in the water for a few minutes. That night the two of them fought to stay alive, and by morning the officer who thought he was saving one helpless little dog would begin to understand that the storm had placed them together for a reason. Before we begin, please like, share, and subscribe. And tell us, where are you watching from today? Late that gray afternoon in Newbern, North Carolina, the storm had moved inland, but swollen river water still covered the lower roads and carried broken branches, loose boards, and pieces of ruined homes through the city. Officer Wesley Grant drove slowly along the edge of the flooded district, watching the road disappear beneath muddy water in several places. At 52, Wesley had spent more than 25 years in local law enforcement. He was calm, dependable, and used to being the person others called when something went wrong. His assignment that afternoon was to inspect damaged roads, mark unsafe crossings, and record areas that might still need emergency crews. Wesley lived alone in a small house near the edge of town. His coworkers sometimes joked that retirement would confuse him because he would not know what to do without a radio calling his name. Wesley always laughed with them. He never mentioned how quiet his house felt at night, or how easily a man could become used to silence if he lived with it long enough. He stopped near a low road beside the river where the water had pushed far beyond its banks. Something moved between two drifting branches. At first, Wesley thought it was another piece of debris. Then a small head lifted above the surface. He stepped closer. A puppy. The little dog could not have been more than 2 months old. His fur was soaked flat against a thin body, and his soft ears had not fully risen yet. Both front paws were hooked over a narrow piece of broken wood. Almost everything else was underwater. The current pulled hard. One paw slipped. The puppy struggled and managed to hook it back over the wood. His head dropped until his nose nearly touched the water, then lifted again. He did not bark. He seemed too tired even for that. Wesley turned immediately toward his patrol car. A life ring and rope were stored behind the rear seat. He had taken only a few steps when something made him look back. The piece of wood was still there. The puppy was gone. Wesley stopped cold. No, he ran back to the water. The empty board rolled once in the current and drifted farther downstream. There was no sign of the puppy. Wesley did not waste another second going back for the life ring. He entered the water immediately. Cold brown water rose around him, then the bottom disappeared beneath his boots. A branch struck his shoulder as he swam toward the place where the puppy had vanished. Wesley took a breath and went under. The water was too muddy to see through. His hands searched blindly. Nothing. He surfaced, took another breath, and went down again. This time his fingers touched something soft. Fur. Wesley grabbed the small body and kicked toward the surface. He came up with the puppy pressed against his chest. The little dog coughed weakly and opened his mouth for air. His body felt almost weightless in Wesley's arms. "Come on," Wesley said. "Stay with me." The puppy's front paws caught the fabric of Wesley's uniform and held on. Wesley turned toward shore. Then the wind changed. It came hard across the water, bending the nearby trees. Rain began falling again, quickly growing heavier. The trailing edge of the storm had returned faster than expected. Wesley started swimming toward the road. The current pushed him sideways. He corrected his direction and tried again, but the water kept carrying them away from shore. The puppy could no longer hold himself above the surface. He climbed higher against Wesley until his front legs were wrapped around Wesley's shoulder. Wesley supported him with one arm and kept swimming. His breathing became heavier. The rain struck his face and the road ahead seemed no closer. After another attempt, Wesley stopped fighting directly against the current. He knew what exhaustion could do in moving water. If he kept forcing a straight path toward shore, both of them would lose. Wesley looked downstream. Through the rain, he saw something dark caught between several partially submerged trees. A small wooden boat, old and weathered but still floating. "That'll have to do," Wesley said. He changed direction and swam diagonally with the current. The puppy's head rested weakly against his neck. "Stay with me, little guy." The boat moved in and out of view behind the rain, but Wesley kept going. At last, his hand struck the wooden side. He grabbed the rail and held on while the current pulled at his legs. For several seconds, Wesley could do nothing except breathe. Then he reached beneath the puppy. "You first." He lifted the little dog over the side and pushed him onto the floorboards. The puppy landed awkwardly and lay still. Wesley tried to climb after him. His first attempt failed when his wet sleeve slipped from the rail. He dropped back into the water, tightened his grip, and tried again. This time he got one arm over the side, found a place for his boot, and dragged himself aboard. Wesley collapsed onto the floor. For a few moments, neither of them moved. Then the puppy slowly raised himself and shook his soaked body. Water sprayed directly across Wesley's face. Wesley closed his eyes. When he opened them, he looked at the tiny dog. Really? Now you're worried about being wet? The puppy stared back at him. The corner of Wesley's mouth lifted for half a second. Then the boat shifted beneath them and the moment passed. Wesley reached for the radio clipped to his uniform. Water ran from it when he lifted it. He pressed the transmit button. Grant to dispatch, do you copy? Only static answered. He tried again. Officer Grant, Northern Flood Zone, do you copy? Broken sound came through the speaker, too weak to understand, then disappeared. Wesley lowered the radio. That could be better. The puppy had started trembling again. Wesley removed his wet outer jacket and wrapped it around the little body, then pulled him closer to protect him from the wind. Only now did he have time to examine him. There were scratches along the puppy's paws and lower legs. Some looked fresh, others did not. Wesley carefully touched one of the older marks. The edge had already begun to close. He frowned. The puppy's stomach was nearly empty. Deep beneath the wet fur, Wesley also found patches of older mud close to the skin, mud that had dried before becoming wet again. Wesley looked down at the puppy. You've been out here longer than I thought. The little dog gave a tired blink. Wesley turned toward the flooded city beyond the boat. Those marks changed the picture. The puppy had not simply fallen into the water moments before Wesley found him. He had already been struggling before that, for hours perhaps, maybe even since the night before. Wesley could not know how far the current had carried him, or how many times he had nearly lost whatever small thing kept him above water. He only knew that a 2-month-old puppy had been fighting alone long before Wesley saw those two paws on the broken board. A stronger gust pushed against the boat. The hole shifted slightly where it was trapped among the trees. Then Wesley heard a faint sound from beneath the covered section near the bow. Drip. He looked toward it. Another drop followed. The radio beside him gave one weak crackle and fell silent again. Daylight was fading quickly. Wesley tightened the jacket around the puppy and rested one hand gently against his back. All right, he said, one problem at a time. The puppy curled closer. Outside, the river moved dark beneath the rain. Wesley had gone into the water, believing he only needed to save one small life. Now he was stranded on an old wooden boat, nearly out of contact with anyone on shore. With night closing in and water beginning to find its way inside, getting the puppy out of the river had only been the first problem. Now Wesley had to keep both of them alive until morning. Night settled over the flooded edge of Newbern, and the world around the old wooden boat narrowed to rain, dark water, and the steady knock of branches against submerged trees. Wesley sat beneath the small covered section near the bow and listened to the boat complain around him. The hull creaked whenever the current pushed against it. Rain tapped across the roof in uneven waves, sometimes soft, sometimes hard enough to make the old boards tremble. The boat was still caught between several trees, which kept it from drifting farther downstream. For now, that was good news. There was very little other good news. Wesley checked the small engine twice. Nothing. He pulled the starter again. The engine gave a weak cough, then died. All right, he muttered. You can be difficult later. The radio was no better, every few minutes. As Wesley pressed the transmit button and tried again. Grant to dispatch, do you copy? Static. Once he thought he heard part of a voice, then it disappeared. He set the radio beside him and looked down at the puppy wrapped in his wet jacket. The little dog had stopped shaking. That worried Wesley more than the trembling had. He touched the puppy's side. Cold, too cold. Wesley immediately pulled off the damp shirt beneath his uniform and shifted closer to the driest corner of the boat. He placed the puppy against his chest, then wrapped the jacket around both of them as tightly as he could. Come on, he said quietly. You've done enough fighting for one day. The puppy did not respond. Wesley lowered his face and listened. A faint breath, then another. He waited several minutes and checked again, still breathing. The rain continued. Wesley kept one hand against the puppy's back, feeling for movement. A long time passed before something finally changed. One small paw slowly reached forward and rested across Wesley's wrist. He looked down. The puppy's eyes opened just enough to find him. Still here, the little eyes blinked once. Wesley let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. He had been calling the puppy little guy since pulling him from the water. But sitting there in the dark, the words suddenly felt too temporary. You need a name. The puppy remained still. Wesley considered it for a moment. Toby. One soft ear moved. Wesley nodded. Toby it is. The name did not solve anything, but it made the small life against his chest feel less like something the storm had dropped into his hands, and more like someone he had a responsibility to protect. After Toby warmed slightly, Wesley searched the covered section of the boat. He found a sealed bottle of water beneath a bench, 2 old towels, a basic first aid box, and a few tools in a rusted metal tray. Most of the supplies looked forgotten, but they were dry enough to use. Wesley poured a little water into the bottle cap. Slow. He touched it to Toby's mouth. At first nothing happened. Then the puppy's tongue moved, one small lick, then another. That's enough for now. Wesley cleaned the cuts along Toby's paws. Some were shallow. One near the back foot was deeper, though not bleeding heavily anymore. Wesley wrapped it with a clean strip of cloth from the first aid box. Toby watched his hands without resisting. Once the puppy was settled again, Wesley turned his attention to the boat. The faint dripping he had heard earlier had become more regular. He followed the sound to a narrow seam along the lower side of the covered section. Water was entering slowly, gathering in a shallow puddle before running toward the center of the floor. Not enough to sink them immediately, enough to become a problem if ignored. Wesley found a scrap of wood, some old cloth, and a small hammer. As he moved across the floor, he heard a soft scrape behind him. He turned. Toby had crawled out of the jacket. "Stay there." Wesley placed him back on the folded towel. He returned to the leak. A minute later, another scrape. Toby was coming toward him again, unsteady on his feet. Wesley picked him up and carried him back. "You're supposed to be resting." Toby waited until Wesley turned away, then followed again. On the third attempt, Wesley looked down at the tiny puppy standing beside his boot, swaying slightly but refusing to stay behind. "Your management now." Toby sat down suddenly, as if the job title had been accepted. One ear folded sideways. Wesley shook his head and returned to work. He packed the cloth into the seam, pressed the wood against it, and secured it as best he could. The dripping slowed, not perfect, good enough for the moment. Hours passed. The storm did not become violent again, but the cold and constant rain wore down everything they touched. Wesley tried the radio several more times. Nothing useful came back. He checked Toby. Still breathing, checked the leak. Still holding, checked the engine. Still dead. Eventually, exhaustion caught him. He sat against the inside wall with Toby wrapped beside him and told himself he would close his eyes for only a minute. He did not remember falling asleep. The patch along the lower seam shifted while he rested. Water began to enter again. At first, it formed a thin line across the floor. Then the line widened. Toby woke when the cold reached the towel beneath him. He lifted his head. Water touched one paw. The puppy gave a weak whine. Wesley did not move. Toby struggled upright and crossed the short distance between them. He pushed his nose against Wesley's hand. No response. He licked Wesley's chin. Still nothing. Then Toby lifted one small paw and scratched at the front of Wesley's shirt. Wesley's eyes opened. For a second, he did not understand what had woken him. Then his boots shifted. Water moved around it. Wesley sat up immediately. The puddle had spread across a large section of the floor. He looked toward the seam. The patch had loosened. Good catch. Wesley moved fast. He pulled the wood free, packed more cloth into the opening, then found another flat piece from beneath a broken seat. He pressed it over the leak and secured it with two small screws from the tool tray. The boat rocked while he worked. Water continued entering around his hands. Toby remained nearby, watching. "Stay back." For once, the puppy listened. After nearly 20 minutes, the flow reduced to a slow drip again. Wesley sat back against the wall, breathing hard. His arms felt heavy. His eyes burned from lack of sleep. Toby crawled over and settled beside his leg. Wesley looked at him. Guest management finally earned the title. This time, Wesley smiled. A real smile. Small, tired, but real. Toby rested his chin against Wesley's boot. The rain began to soften sometime later. The hard drumming on the roof became a steady whisper. For the first time all night, Wesley could hear more than the storm. Water moving between houses, a loose piece of metal turning somewhere in the current, branches scraping against a wall. Then Toby lifted his head. Wesley noticed immediately. The puppy's body remained weak, but his attention had sharpened. Both soft ears turned toward the dark neighborhood beyond the trees. "What is it?" Toby stared in one direction. Wesley listened. Nothing. Then came a sound. Knock. Wesley looked toward the flooded houses. Silence followed. A few seconds later, knock, knock. It sounded like wood hitting something solid, probably debris. Wesley almost dismissed it, then lightning flashed across the clouds. For one brief moment, the flooded neighborhood appeared in pale white light. Wesley saw a house not far beyond the trees. The lower floor was almost completely underwater. Near the upper level, a loose door swung against its frame. That explained the knocking. Wesley looked back at Toby. The puppy had not relaxed. His eyes remained fixed on the house. Then Wesley heard another sound. Very faint, he leaned forward. The wind moved through the branches. Water slapped against the hull. Then the sound came again, not a knock, a voice, weak and distant. Wesley stood as quickly as his tired legs allowed and moved to the side of the boat. Hello, no clear answer. He waited. Then from the direction of the flooded house, another faint call drifted through the darkness. Wesley looked down at Toby. The puppy was still staring toward the same place. That wasn't the wind. Wesley turned toward the silent engine. The boat was leaking. The radio barely worked. Toby was still weak. Wesley had almost nothing left in reserve, but somewhere inside that flooded house, there might be someone who had survived the night and was still waiting to be found. Wesley looked once more into the darkness. Morning had not arrived yet, but now they had a reason to reach it. The darkness had begun to thin when Wesley tried the engine again. Gray morning light spread slowly over the flooded neighborhood, revealing rooftops, broken fences, and trees standing in water where streets had once been. The rain had weakened to a fine mist, but the river still moved heavily between the houses. Wesley pulled the starter. The engine coughed once, then stopped. He waited a few seconds and tried again. Another weak cough. Beside his feet, Toby lay wrapped inside Wesley's jacket, his small body curled tightly for warmth. Opened his eyes when the engine made a rough grinding sound, then lowered his head again. "Come on," Wesley said to the machine. "Just give me something." He adjusted the fuel line, checked the connection one more time, and pulled again. This time the engine sputtered. Wesley froze. It almost died, then caught again with an uneven rattle. Not strong, not reliable, but running. That's enough. He eased the boat free from the trees and turned toward the flooded house where he had heard the faint voice during the night. Toby stayed near his feet, wrapped in the jacket. The boat moved slowly. Wesley did not trust the engine enough to push it hard, and the water was filled with branches, pieces of fencing, and things hidden just beneath the surface. As they came closer to the house, he could see that the entire first floor was underwater. A broken porch rail floated near the side. One upstairs window had shattered. Then Wesley saw movement near the rear of the house. A woman was sitting on a low section of roof beneath an overhang. "Ma'am," the woman lifted one arm. "I'm here." Her voice was weak but clear enough. Wesley guided the boat as close as he could. The woman was Helen Parker, 76, a retired elementary school librarian who had lived in the house for more than 30 years. She was small, soaked from the rain, and exhausted from spending most of the night above the floodwater. One leg was stretched stiffly in front of her. Wesley tied the boat to a strong section of railing and climbed toward her. "Can you stand?" "With help." "What happened to your leg?" "Twisted my ankle getting through the up stairs window." Wesley crouched beside her. "You've been out here all night." Helen nodded. "The water came faster than I expected. By the time I understood how bad it was, the stairs were already gone." Her voice remained steady, but Wesley could see how cold she was. He helped her carefully to her feet. Helen winced when she placed weight on the injured ankle. "Don't force it." "I wasn't planning to." Wesley supported most of her weight as they moved toward the boat. Getting her down was slow, but they managed. Once Helen was seated safely, Wesley wrapped one of the old towels around her shoulders. She looked down and noticed Toby. The puppy was watching from inside the jacket. "Your dog." Wesley checked the knot holding the boat. "Met him yesterday." Helen looked at Toby, then at Wesley. "Doesn't look like he knows that." Wesley glanced down. Toby had already moved closer to his boot. "Apparently we skipped the formal introduction." Helen gave the faintest smile. Wesley prepared to untie the boat. Then Toby made a soft whining sound. Wesley looked down. The puppy was not watching Helen. He was staring toward the upper floor of the house. Toby lifted his head higher. His eyes remained fixed on the dark opening of the broken window. Wesley followed his gaze. "Anyone else inside?" Helen shook her head. "No, I live alone." Toby continued staring. Wesley waited. The puppy gave another quiet whine. Maybe he had heard something moving. Maybe it was nothing. After the night they had just survived, Wesley was not willing to assume. "I'm going to check." Helen looked toward the house. "There's nobody else. I know. I'll be quick." Wesley secured the boat again and climbed through the upstairs window. Inside, the house was dim and damp. The smell of river water and wet wood filled the rooms. Furniture had shifted. A small table lay on its side. Books and clothing were scattered across the floor where water had passed through before dropping again. "Police," Wesley called. No answer. He moved through the upper rooms. Empty. Near the stairs he stopped. A line of dark mud marked the wall well above the current water level below. Branches, fabric, and small pieces of debris were caught between the stair rails. Something hung among them. Wesley reached down. A small collar. It was narrow enough for a puppy, dirty from the flood, with a broken buckle on one end. Wesley turned it over in his hand. No tag. No name. He looked back toward the window. Toby was still visible in the boat. The collar clearly did not belong to him. Toby had been found without one, and the buckle showed no sign that it had recently broken from his neck. Still, the sight of it made Wesley think about what he had noticed the night before. The scratches on Toby's paws, the dried mud deep beneath the wet fur, the empty stomach, the exhaustion far beyond what a few minutes in the river should have caused. Wesley looked again at the mud line on the wall. Flood water had moved through this area much earlier. If Toby had been carried through neighborhoods like this one before Wesley found him, then the puppy's struggle had not begun near the road. It could have begun hours earlier, maybe during the worst part of the storm. Wesley put the small collar in his pocket and finished checking the room. No one else was inside. He returned to the boat. Helen looked at him. "Anything?" "No people." Wesley showed her the collar. "Found this caught near the stairs." Helen studied it, then looked toward Toby. "That his?" "No." Wesley slipped it into his hand again. "But the water came through here long before I found him." Helen watched Toby for a moment. The puppy had lowered his head back onto Wesley's jacket. "That little thing fought a long time before you found him." Wesley looked down at the scratches along Toby's paws. "Yeah," he paused. "Long enough." Helen did not ask anything else. Wesley untied the boat and carefully pulled away from the house. The engine continued its uneven rattle. For several minutes Toby slept, then he opened his eyes. His head lifted. He looked toward the water, then Helen, then around the boat. Finally, he found Wesley standing at the controls. Toby relaxed almost immediately and lowered himself again. Helen noticed. Wesley pretended not to. A minute later, she said, "He keeps checking where you are." Wesley kept his attention on the water ahead, probably checking who has the food. Helen looked at Toby's thin body. "Keep telling yourself that." Wesley almost smiled. The boat moved slowly through what had once been a residential street. He knew the nearest evacuation route lay beyond a wider stretch of water to the east. If they could reach it, rescue crews would have a much better chance of seeing them. For the first time since nightfall, Wesley allowed himself to think they might actually be getting out. Then he rounded the remains of a wooden fence. A wall of fallen trees filled the channel ahead. Several large trunks had collapsed across the flooded street, tangled together with branches and storm debris. Wesley reduced the engine. He studied the blockage, no opening. He turned the boat toward another passage between two houses. That route narrowed quickly. The water became too shallow, and the propeller struck something beneath the surface. Wesley pulled back immediately. He tried the opposite side. The current there moved much faster, too fast for an old boat carrying 3 exhausted passengers. Wesley returned to calmer water and shut the engine down for a moment. He checked the fuel tank. His expression changed. Helen saw it. "How bad?" "Low." "How low?" "Low enough that I don't want to guess wrong." Wesley looked back toward the route they had come from. Returning to the house would put them back in an area hidden from rescue crews. Going around the fallen trees might use the last of the fuel. If the engine stopped in moving water, they could lose control of the boat completely. Toby shifted inside the jacket and rested his head against Wesley's boot. Wesley looked at him, then at Helen. A few hours earlier, there had been 2 lives on the boat. Now there were 3. He started the engine again and listened to its weak, uneven rhythm. Ahead stood a blocked route. Behind them waited the flooded neighborhood. And inside the tank, there was not enough fuel for many mistakes. Wesley placed both hands on the controls. Getting Helen off that roof had been the easy decision. The next one would be harder. The afternoon passed slowly beneath a dull gray sky. The worst of the storm was gone, but the flooded neighborhood still felt cut off from the rest of Newbern. Water surrounded the houses, fallen trees blocked the nearest route, and the old boat sat almost hidden behind broken roofs and tangled branches. Wesley kept the engine off. Every minute it ran meant less fuel. He stood near the controls and studied the water ahead again, even though he already knew what he would see. The fallen trees remained packed across the flooded street. To the left, the water was too shallow. To the right, the current moved faster than the boat could safely handle. Behind them lay the route back toward Helen's house. None of the choices were good. Wesley checked the fuel tank once more, still low. He lowered the cap and looked toward the sky. Daylight would not last forever. If they stayed where they were, rescue crews might never see them through the trees and damaged buildings. If they tried to go around the blockage, the engine could run dry before they reached open water. For the first time since pulling Toby from the river, Wesley had no clear next move. Toby lay inside the folded jacket near his feet. The puppy had slept most of the afternoon. When Wesley offered him water, Toby turned his head away after only a few licks. That bothered Wesley. He touched the puppy gently along the side, still breathing steadily, still warm enough, but tired, too tired. Helen sat against the side of the boat with her injured ankle raised on a folded towel. The swelling had increased, and Wesley could see pain cross her face whenever the boat shifted. "You all right?" Helen nodded. "I've had better afternoons." Wesley looked at her ankle. "That wasn't the answer. It's the one I have." He almost smiled, but the feeling passed quickly. Wesley picked up the radio again. "Grant to dispatch, do you copy?" Static answered. He moved closer to the open side of the boat and raised the radio higher. "Officer Grant to dispatch. 3 people aboard. Flooded Snorts residential area north of the evacuation route. Do you copy?" For a second, something came through. A voice, or maybe just interference. Wesley held still. Nothing followed. He tried again. Silence. He set the radio down and checked the engine connection, then the leak, then Toby, then Helen, then the water level beyond the boat. A few minutes later, he checked everything again. The same questions returned every time. Could the boat stay where it was? Would the leak hold? Would Toby keep getting weaker? Would Helen's ankle become a larger problem? Would anyone hear the radio before dark? Wesley had been awake for most of 2 days. The lack of sleep had started to show in small ways. His hands were less steady. His thoughts took longer to settle. Twice he reached for a tool and forgot what he had planned to use it for. He knew exhaustion could become dangerous before a person realized it. That knowledge did not make it easier. Wesley removed the back panel from the radio and examined the damp connection inside. He had already tried drying it twice, but there was little else left to do. He reached for the screwdriver. It slipped from his fingers and struck the floor. Wesley stared at it. The sound seemed louder than it should have been. He bent down to pick it up, then stayed there. Instead of standing again, Wesley lowered himself onto the floor of the boat. His back rested against the bench. His hands hung between his knees. Helen watched him quietly. Wesley looked toward the blocked route, then at the engine, finally at Toby. "I don't know if I can get us out of this." It was the first time he had said the thought aloud. Helen did not rush to answer. She did not tell him he was strong. She did not promise rescue was coming. Instead, she looked down at Toby sleeping near Wesley's boot. Then don't get us all the way out. Wesley turned toward her. Helen spoke calmly. Just get us through the next 10 minutes. Wesley said nothing. Helen nodded toward the radio. 10 minutes, that's all. The idea was almost too simple, but Wesley understood what she meant. He had been trying to solve the entire night before it arrived. The route, the fuel, the rescue, Toby, Helen, everything at once. He picked up the screwdriver. 10 minutes. Wesley checked the radio connection and dried it again. When that was done, he checked Toby's breathing and offered another small amount of water. The puppy took 3 slow licks. Good enough. Another 10 minutes. Wesley inspected the patch over the leak, still holding. Another 10. He studied the current and made sure the boat had not shifted closer to the fallen trees. Time stopped being one large problem. It became smaller pieces, manageable pieces. After several rounds, Wesley reached beneath the bench for one of the dry cloths he had been using on the radio. It was gone. He looked around. Toby had crawled onto it and was lying directly in the middle. Helen noticed. Management. Wesley stared at the puppy. I regret telling you that. Helen laughed softly. Wesley did too. It lasted only a few seconds, but those seconds mattered. He gently pulled one corner of the cloth free and left the rest under Toby. You win. The puppy barely opened his eyes. Wesley returned to the radio. Another 10 minutes passed, then another. Toby eventually woke and pushed himself upright. He moved closer to Wesley and leaned against his leg. Wesley lowered his hand to check him. Toby lifted one small paw and placed it over Wesley's wrist. The same place as before. Wesley looked down. 10 more. Toby left his paw there. Wesley took that as an answer. He pressed the radio button again. Grant to dispatch. Static. He waited, then something changed. A voice broke through, weak, broken. Officer Grant. Wesley stood so quickly the boat rocked. Grant here, come again. The signal vanished. Dispatch, this is Grant. I copy, come again. Nothing. Helen sat forward. Was that them? I think so. Wesley tried again. No answer. 1 minute passed, then 2. He kept the radio in his hand. The speaker suddenly cracked. Officer Grant, if you copy, key twice. Wesley pressed the transmit button twice. Click, click, silence followed. He waited. Toby rested against his boot. Helen gripped the edge of the bench. Then the voice returned. We have your signal. Wesley closed his eyes for 1 second, not long, just enough. Helen lowered her head and let out a slow breath. Wesley pressed the button. 3 aboard, 1 elderly female with an injured ankle, 1 puppy, weak but stable. The response came in pieces, but the important part was clear. Stay in position. Rescue was moving toward them. Wesley looked at Helen. Looks like staying put was the right choice. Helen leaned back. Ask me after they get here. Wesley smiled faintly. They waited. This time the waiting felt different. About 15 minutes later, Helen pointed through the trees. There. Wesley followed her hand. A light moved in the distance, then disappeared behind a damaged roof. A few seconds later it appeared again. Another light joined it. Rescue crews coming closer. Helen tightened both hands around the side of the boat. Wesley looked down at Toby. The puppy was still curled in the jacket, too tired to understand that the danger was finally ending. Wesley crouched and touched his back. We made it. The words should have felt like an ending. Instead, another thought arrived. Helen would go to a hospital. Wesley would report back to the department. The boat would be left behind. Normal life would begin again. His eyes remained on Toby. The puppy had no collar, no identification, no one waiting nearby that Wesley knew of. For nearly 2 days, Wesley had thought only about keeping him alive. He had not allowed himself to think beyond that. Now the rescue lights were almost there, and for the first time, Wesley had to consider what happened after survival. He looked at the tiny paw resting against the jack. Soon they would reach dry ground. Then someone would ask the question Wesley had managed to avoid since the moment he pulled Toby from beneath the water. Where did this little dog belong? Wesley did not have an answer. And strangely, that question felt harder than any of the others. By the time the rescue crews reached the old boat, the worst of the danger had passed. Helen was helped into a medical transport vehicle and taken to the hospital for her injured ankle and dehydration. Wesley watched until the doors closed, then turned back toward Toby. The puppy was wrapped in the same jacket that had carried him through most of the night. He looked small again, smaller somehow, now that the storm was behind them. A veterinary volunteer directed Wesley to a clinic that had stayed open through the emergency. The clinic belonged to Dr. Rachel Monroe, 45, a veterinarian known for being calm under pressure and practical about almost everything. She had worked nearly without stopping since the storm began, treating injured pets, checking animals brought in by rescue crews, and helping shelters deal with the sudden flood of displaced dogs and cats. Rachel took Toby immediately. Wesley stayed nearby while she examined him. She checked his breathing, heart rate, pause, belly, and temperature. She looked carefully at the scratches Wesley had cleaned on the boat. After several minutes, she stood. He's young, 8 or 9 weeks, I'd guess. Wesley looked at Toby. That young? Rachel nodded. Dehydrated, exhausted, several abrasions on the paws and lower belly, but I don't see anything that looks permanent. So he'll be all right, with rest, fluids, food, and time, I think so. Wesley let out a slow breath. Rachel scanned Toby for a microchip. Nothing. She checked for a tag or any other identification. Nothing there either. We'll post his photo with the shelters and rescue groups, she said. Someone may be looking for him. Wesley nodded. That was the reasonable answer. Someone may be looking for him. Someone may come. Someone may take him home. Wesley looked down at Toby one more time. The puppy was already falling asleep. I rescued him, Wesley said. That's all. Rachel looked at him but did not argue. All right. Wesley returned to work that same day. Newbern still had roads to inspect, homes to check, and people who needed help. His schedule quickly filled again. That should have made everything simple. It did not. Wesley told himself that Toby needed a proper home, a family with time, a yard, someone who knew how to raise a puppy. Wesley worked long shifts. He lived alone. He had never raised a dog that young. Toby would not stay small forever, and a growing dog would need training, exercise, patience, and more attention than Wesley was certain he could give. The argument made sense. He repeated it often. Then he drove past the clinic and looked toward the building without meaning to. Another day, he heard a dog bark from a yard and immediately thought of Toby. That evening, Wesley found the jacket he had worn on the boat hanging over a chair. Several small hairs still clung to the fabric. He stood there longer than he needed to. At the clinic, Toby was physically improving. Emotionally, Rachel was less satisfied. The puppy ate, but not enough. He slept, but often near the front of his enclosure instead of farther back where it was quieter. Whenever the door opened, Toby lifted his head. Whenever a vehicle stopped outside, he listened. If the sound belonged to a police car, he became alert immediately. Rachel noticed the pattern. She said nothing at first. Several days passed. No one claimed Toby. The shelters reposted his photo. The rescue groups checked their lists of missing animals. Still nothing. One evening, Wesley finished his shift later than expected. He sat in his patrol car for several minutes after parking. Then he started the engine again. He told himself he was only going to check on Toby, nothing more. The clinic was quiet when Wesley arrived. Rachel was still there finishing notes from the day. She looked up when he entered. Long shift, long week. Rachel nodded. Wesley glanced toward the hallway. How's he doing? Better. That sounded like there was another part. Rachel closed the folder in front of her. He's healing, eating a little more, still watching the door. Wesley looked away. Probably normal after what happened. Maybe. Rachel did not say anything else. Wesley walked down the hall. Toby was asleep in a small bed near the front of his enclosure. He looked cleaner now. The cuts on his paws were healing. His breathing was slow and even. Wesley stopped several feet away. For a moment he only watched. Then he took one step forward. Toby's head lifted. His eyes opened. He stared toward Wesley. Then he tried to stand. His front paws slipped slightly beneath him. He caught himself. Toby. The puppy recognized the voice. He moved forward quickly, too quickly. After only a few steps, his legs gave way. Wesley dropped to one knee. Easy, Toby tried again. He pushed himself upright, took another step, then sank back down. For a second, Wesley thought he would stop. He did not. Toby began crawling, slowly. One paw, then the other. Wesley stayed where he was. The distance between them was only a few feet, but for Toby it seemed to take everything he had. When he finally reached Wesley, he pressed against his knee. Then one small paw lifted. It settled over Wesley's wrist, the exact same place as before. Wesley looked down at it. He remembered the boat. That first night when Toby had been so cold, Wesley was afraid he might stop breathing. The paw had rested there then, still here. Later, when Wesley had been exhausted and close to giving up, the same small paw had returned. Keep going. Now there was no storm, no flood water, no sinking boat, nothing dangerous at all, and yet Toby held his wrist the same way. Wesley understood. Stay. The thought came quietly. That was what made it impossible to ignore. Wesley placed his other hand beneath Toby and lifted him carefully. The puppy settled against his chest at once. His body relaxed. Rachel had been standing at the end of the hallway. She gave them a moment before speaking. Still looking for the right family, Wesley looked at Toby. The puppy had already closed his eyes. No, Rachel waited. Wesley looked up. No, I'm not. The next morning, Wesley returned. This time he did not pretend he was only visiting. Rachel placed the adoption papers on the counter. Wesley read each page, then signed. When he finished, Rachel handed him a folder. Vaccination schedule, feeding guide, follow-up appointment, basic puppy care. Wesley accepted it. Rachel added, you know puppies don't come with an off switch. At that exact moment, Toby lowered his head and caught Wesley's shoelace between his teeth. Wesley looked down. Toby tugged once. Good timing. Rachel laughed. Wesley bent and freed the lace carefully from Toby's mouth. Then he lifted him. The puppy settled against his arm as if the arrangement had already been decided days ago. Wesley carried him toward the door. He had entered the clinic telling himself he had only come to check on a dog he once rescued. He left with Toby in his arms, a folder of instructions under one hand, and something he had not expected waiting for him behind that door. A new responsibility, a new routine, and though Wesley had not yet said the word aloud, a family. Toby moved into Wesley's house 2 days after the adoption papers were signed, and Wesley quickly discovered that pulling a puppy from flood water had been easier than convincing one to sleep where he was supposed to. The house had always been quiet. Wesley had lived there alone for years, and everything had its place. His boots stayed by the door. His keys rested in the same bowl near the kitchen. Nothing moved unless he moved it. That changed almost immediately. Wesley had bought Toby a soft new bed and placed it beside the chair where he usually sat in the evening. Toby stepped into it, turned in a circle, and lay down. Wesley nodded. Good. 30 seconds later, Toby climbed out and curled up on the floor beside Wesley's chair. Wesley picked him up and returned him to the bed. Toby waited, then climbed out again. The third time, Wesley looked down at the puppy curled against his boot. Fine, you win. Toby closed his eyes as if the matter had been settled properly. The next morning, Wesley found the dog bed untouched. One of his socks was missing. The other was under Toby's head like a pillow. Wesley stared at the expensive bed, then at the sleeping puppy. Money well spent. That became the first of many small changes. Wesley began checking the clock before leaving work because Toby needed to eat on time. He learned to keep shoes away from the edge of the hallway. Tiny muddy paw prints appeared across the kitchen after rainy mornings. A cardboard box from the grocery store held Toby's attention longer than the toy Wesley had paid $15 for. The house was no longer silent. Sometimes it was inconvenient. Wesley found that he did not mind. The real change became clear on the morning of his first full shift after bringing Toby home. Wesley dressed in uniform. Toby followed him into the bedroom. Wesley picked up his duty belt. Toby followed him into the hallway. Wesley collected his keys. Toby followed him to the front door. Wesley stopped. Toby sat directly behind his boots and looked up. I have to work. Toby tilted his head. Wesley waited as if expecting that to solve something. It did not. Apparently that argument means nothing to you. He crouched and rubbed Toby gently behind one ear. I'll be back. The words felt unusual. Wesley had said them to coworkers, neighbors, and people he was helping through difficult days. He could not remember the last time he had said them inside his own house and meant them as a promise to someone waiting there. He closed the door. Through the narrow glass panel, Toby remained sitting on the other side. Wesley walked to his patrol car, opened the door, then looked back once more. He sat behind the wheel for several seconds before starting the engine. During the shift, he checked the time more than usual. By late afternoon, two of his coworkers had noticed. One caught him looking at his watch and smiled. Wesley ignored it. An hour later, he checked again. This time, another officer looked over and grinned. Nobody said anything. They did not need to. When Wesley finally finished his shift, he drove home without making the usual extra stop for coffee. He pulled into the driveway and walked toward the house. Before he had opened the door completely, he heard the sound of paws running across the floor. Toby appeared around the corner and rushed toward him. There was no flood, no storm, no danger. Toby did not need Wesley to lift him from water or keep him alive through the night. He was simply happy that Wesley had come home. The puppy circled his boots, tail moving so hard that his whole body seemed involved. Wesley stood just inside the doorway and looked down at him. For years, he had thought of the house as quiet because that was what houses became when one person lived alone. Only now did he understand the difference between quiet and empty. Someone had been waiting for him. That changed the sound of the entire place. A few weeks later, Wesley took Toby to visit Helen. Her ankle was healing well, and she had returned home after repairs made the house safe again. Helen had prepared something for Toby. It was a small handmade blanket, simple and warm, with the name Toby stitched into one corner. Wesley ran a finger over the letters. Helen looked at the puppy. Every little thing deserves something with its name on it. Wesley understood what she meant. They might never know exactly where Toby had come from. No one could say how long he had been in the flood or what had happened before Wesley saw him clinging to that broken piece of wood. The unanswered questions no longer felt as important as they once had. Toby had a name now. He had a home. He had someone who came back through the door every evening. Months passed. Toby grew quickly. His body became stronger, though he still had the uneven energy of a young dog. His ears began to stand, but not quite at the same angle. Wesley sometimes looked at him and said, "You look like you're listening to two conversations at once." Toby never became a police dog. Wesley never expected him to. At a few community events, people from the neighborhood recognized Toby from the rescue photos and stopped to greet him. Older residents rubbed his ears. Children asked questions about the flood. To everyone else, Toby became the puppy Officer Grant had saved. To Wesley, he was simply Toby. One afternoon, several months after the storm, Wesley drove through the area where they had first met. The water was gone. Repair crews had replaced damaged fencing. Fresh boards covered parts of several homes. New trees had been planted where older ones had fallen. Toby sat in the passenger seat, watching the world through the window. Wesley slowed near the flooded road. Then he saw something caught in a damaged section of fence, a small piece of weathered wood. He stopped the truck. Toby climbed down with him. Wesley walked to the fence and pulled the board free. He turned it in his hands. There was no way to know if it was the exact piece Toby had clung to that day. It only looked similar. That was enough. Toby sat beside him. Wesley looked from the wood to the dog. Once a piece of broken board had been the only thing between that tiny puppy and the water. Wesley placed it in the back of the truck, not because he wanted to remember how close Toby had come to dying, because he wanted to remember where their life together had started. They drove home. Halfway there, a light rain began tapping against the roof. Toby stiffened, only slightly, but Wesley noticed. The puppy looked toward the windshield as the rain grew steadier. Some memories lived in the body before the mind had words for them. Wesley lowered one hand beside Toby. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Toby lifted a paw and placed it across Wesley's wrist, the same place as on the boat, the same small gesture that had followed them through the hardest hours. This time, Toby did not need help. He did not need warmth. He did not need Wesley to keep going. He simply left his paw there, then lowered his chin onto Wesley's hand. Wesley continued driving. Neither of them had forgotten the storm. Maybe healing was never about forgetting. Maybe it was about reaching the day when the rain returned and finding that you did not have to face the sound alone. Wesley had pulled Toby from the flood that first afternoon. Months later, he understood that Toby had rescued something too, not from water, from silence. From years of coming home to a place where no one waited, a police officer had saved a puppy. A puppy had given a man a reason to look forward to opening his own front door. Somewhere between those two things, without either of them planning it, they had become a family. In the end, Wesley saved Toby from the flood, but Toby gave Wesley something he had not realized was missing from his life: a reason to come home, someone to wait for him. And a quiet reminder that even the strongest people can still need companionship, comfort, and a second chance at feeling less alone. Maybe that is what this story is really about. Healing does not always mean forgetting what hurt us. Sometimes it simply means finding someone who stays beside us when those memories return. A small puppy clinging to a piece of wood changed one man's life forever. And sometimes the lives we choose to save have a way of saving something inside us, too. What did you think about Wesley and Toby's story? Do you believe animals can come into our lives at exactly the moment we need them most? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please like the video. Share it with someone who may need a little hope today. And subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories about courage, loyalty, kindness, and the special bond between people and animals. Thank you so much for watching and spending this time with us. We truly appreciate having you here. Take care and come back again for more stories that remind us how much love can change a life. If you enjoyed this story and want more incredible sci-fi adventures where humanity surprises the entire galaxy, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in this situation? I'd love to read your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next epic adventure.